California is often referred to as the Golden State, yet many are surprised to learn that about a third of the state's population lives in poverty, and the gap between the rich and the poor is only getting wider. What are the causes and what are the possible solutions to poverty and income inequality? We'll talk to an expert from the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, Sarah Bohn.
BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us. Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
It may be difficult to believe, but California has some of the highest poverty rates in the nation. Why is that so? Our guest is the perfect person to answer that question. She's Sarah Bohn, the Director of Research and Senior Fellow and the Bryson Chair of Policy Research at the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome back to the Maddy Institute.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, let me ask you, what about this poverty rate in California? What's happening? Have things gotten better or worse?
California's poverty rate is relatively high, I would say, at about 18% of residents living on resources below a pretty basic standard. And that's higher than in a lot of other states, even neighboring states. But the good news is that in our latest estimates, we see an improvement in the poverty rate. So about 500,000 Californians fewer are in poverty in 2017 compared to the year prior.
So still high though. So when you're looking at California compared to other states, you wouldn't say we're lower median, we're on the high side.
We are usually in the top 1 or 2.
That's the very high side. Okay, so there are different measures of poverty. People think, it's almost like cost of living. There's different measures of cost of living indices, but in poverty there's different measures. Some are more comprehensive than others. What happens, for example, when you begin to factor in things like key family needs and resources?
So the numbers that I cited to you are from the California Poverty Measure, which is an attempt to have a more comprehensive estimate of need. And in my view, the two important things there are to have an accurate assessment of what it takes to make ends meet, and also to count all the resources that people depend on, which includes not just their earnings, but also resources that they might get from government programs. So just cost of living alone means that a threshold for basic needs in California for a family of 4 is about $32,000. That's about $7,000 more than the federal poverty line, which is based in a 1960s era standard of living and what families used to consume back in those days.
Yeah, you worked on that with the Stanford Poverty Center to kind of put this together. It's actually the Center on Poverty and Inequality. So this has been some academic research to kind of fine-tune this measure of poverty, so we get a better understanding of what it is,
exactly.
How bad it is. Okay, so when you look at the numbers, what do you see? How many Californians are actually living in or near poverty?
So about 7 million Californians are living in poverty today in our latest data. That includes about 1.7 million children in the state. An equal number are actually living just above the poverty line. We refer to it as near poverty, but in my view, that's an important metric to think about and a population to consider because, they might not be counted in poverty in this kind of harsh statistic of are you above or below this number, but they are near poverty and probably also struggling to make ends meet or to really be upwardly mobile.
Kind of the one paycheck away from a disaster, right?
Exactly.
An illness, an accident, a loss of a job, and they're in poverty.
Exactly.
Okay. And I think the numbers that you were talking about are for those near poverty. When I was looking at your report, I want to say 36.4%, almost 4 in 10 are poor or near poor.
Right.
So that's a high number.
So that means about, just over a third of Californians are living in families on resources for a family of 4 in the range of $48,000 or less.
You think about that, you could probably survive, in Central California on those numbers, but you get to the coast where it's expensive, in LA and San Francisco, that would be a tremendous challenge. So poverty levels change though with the social safety net. That adds some protection. There are lots of different programs out there. What impact do these social safety net programs have on poverty levels?
So without major social safety net programs at the state and federal level, an additional about 7% of Californians would be poor based on our research. That means that those major programs we're talking about, tax credit programs, food assistance, housing assistance, those programs kept almost 3 million Californians out of poverty.
3 million, wow. Okay, so what about regional poverty rates? Do safety net programs affect poverty differently where you live by region?
They do, unfortunately, because a lot of anti-poverty programs are kind of not accounting for cost of living. So we see that the social safety net has a much larger impact in Central California where cost of living is cheaper, which is a good thing for residents there, but it means that there's challenges for low-income families living in high-cost areas, which are often where the jobs are.
Yeah, I mean, looking at your report, and they're saying that 13.1% of people living in Central Valley would be poor without these safety net programs, but not a big impact on the Bay Area, only 3.7%.
Yeah, it's much smaller in the Bay, and that's a combination of that cost of living, but also the fact that low-income workers in the Bay actually earn slightly higher wages even for similar work just because of the context of cost of living and wage rates.
But there are high rates also in Los Angeles, though, in Santa Barbara. Is that housing related?
It's that same combination of housing costs as well as kind of low wage work that's much more predominant in Southern California if you could compare it to the Bay Area, for example.
So up next, we're going to talk about who are California's poor. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So who exactly are California's poor? We're talking with Sarah Bohn, an expert in poverty and the California economy with the nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. So does poverty affect different ethnic groups differently, or is poverty equally distributed across ethnic groups?
In California, poverty is not equally distributed across ethnic groups. We observe, using the California Poverty Measure research, that people of color in the state experience poverty at much higher rates than the typical Californian. So, for example, Latinos in California are dramatically more likely to be in poverty. About 23% of Latinos in our state are in families.
Almost a quarter.
Almost a quarter.
Wow.
And that's more than double what it is for example, white Californians in our state.
Okay.
The good news is that rate has dropped a lot since 2011 when we started this research.
Yeah, I think you were saying in your report it was like 1 out of 3 almost in 2011. So there is some improvement. Still a large number, but some improvement.
Yeah.
It would seem that education would play a pretty big role here because it helps on earning potential, et cetera. Seem to impact poverty. True?
Absolutely true. Earnings is really the crux of poverty in California in the sense that safety net programs help families who are in need, but even poor families get most of the resources that they live off of from their earnings. So, in today's economy, that makes
I think a lot of people would be
sense.
surprised by that. Most of the money they comes from money they're actually earning.
It's
not
approximately
not social safety net
exactly.
programs.
Even for our lowest income Californians, about 86% of their total resources come from earnings. So safety net programs do help with a big margin of their.
It's on the margin, though. It's not the primary source of their money. It's
exactly.
earned money is what they're
Right.
living on, basically.
And in today's economy, earnings, of course, are inextricably linked with education.
Right.
And so we do see big differences when you just look at education levels within the household. So families with at least one adult who has a college degree have much smaller poverty rates than other families.
I mean, even having a high school degree, I mean, it makes a big difference. So
Yeah.
those degrees do make a difference. Now, what about child poverty? What can you tell us about that?
So children in California have the highest incidence of poverty across all age groups. About 19% of children in the state are poor compared to about 18% overall. So slightly more, it's about 1.7 million children are in families experiencing need. The social safety net, however, we observe is much more impactful for child poverty, and that's largely because our safety net programs of today target child poverty explicitly, aiming to reduce the need that children and their families face.
And it has a huge effect. According to your numbers, the poverty rate's about 19%, but without the safety net, almost 32%. So about a third of children are taken out of poverty because of these programs.
Exactly. It's around 3 million.
That's an awful lot. That's kind of surprising it has that big effect, but I guess if they're targeting that, that would make sense. One of the things we also looked at was child poverty rates across California. One of the things you looked at. And it was interesting, you look at places like Los Angeles or Orange County or San Diego County, the rates are pretty high. Why even higher than the Valley?
Right.
Why is that?
So housing costs drive up poverty a lot, especially in coastal California and Southern California in particular. What we see is, families there access social safety net programs just like they do in the Central Valley, or at least they try to, but it just has less of an impact on, mitigating that poverty rate because it's kind of the housing costs are eating away at those extra benefits that families receive.
So what about poor children that they're living in these families? Are they living in families where the parents aren't working?
In fact, it's the opposite. So most children who are in poor families have at least one adult, one parent or other adult in the household who's working. About, I want to say around 80% of Californians who are poor live in households with a working adult. And it's really just that their earnings are not sufficient to kind of boost them above the poverty line. That might be because they're not working full-time or because the earnings level itself is just not sufficient. So even half, I think it's around half of parents of poor children are working at least full-time, but still not earning enough to kind of get them out of poverty.
So
and things like childcare costs weigh heavily on these families.
Right. People think about, I want to get a job, but it's also it's costing me as much to get the job because I have to pay for childcare. So, I'm not making a lot to cover my expenses. It's often said that a job is the best poverty program, but the question is it? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Our guest is Sarah Bohn, the Director of Research and a Senior Fellow at the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. And we're talking about poverty in California. I think it's going to surprise a lot of people that most poor families in California have someone who's working. So let's talk about the numbers. What are the numbers exactly again on that, on people that are working but are still poor?
So about 80% of poor families are working in the sense that they have at least one adult in the household who's working. They may be working part-time, full-time, part of the year, or all year. But poverty in California is largely an issue of working poverty where their earnings are not sufficient.
So it's not true that employment, even full-time employment, eliminates poverty.
This is a big challenge in California and in the U.S. that the fact is full-time employment doesn't prevent poverty. And remember, we're talking about poverty based on a pretty minimum level of resources. So $32,000 a year for a family of four. 2 million adults in California are actually working, but still experiencing poverty.
I'm trying to think of the numbers. So $32,000 a year approximately is about $16 an hour. So they want to bring the minimum wage to $15 an hour. That would be a little below what you would need to survive in California.
That's right. So you might need two workers in the family.
Right. It's always dangerous when I do math in my head, but I think I have that right. Okay. So who make up the working poor?
Latinos are just over half of all working poor adults in California. That's slightly higher than their share of kind of the working age population. In addition, single parents are very likely to be working but still poor, as well as those who've completed less education. So those two factors remind me of kind of two of the driving forces. One is how intertwined education and success in our economy are today. And two, just the fact that in today's economy, in a family, you often need two working adults in order to make ends meet, not one, like in our kind of vision from decades ago.
Right, that's no longer the case. I mean, almost in every family, you got both adults are working.
Exactly.
It's very unusual. So where are poverty rates the highest among working adults? I mean, Southern California, Coastal California, Inland California?
The poverty rates are highest among working adults in Southern Coastal California, not exclusively so. They are high in other parts of the state, including the Central Valley. But that's where the numbers really jump out at us, just as poverty rates tend to be a bit higher on the coast because we are accounting for cost of living, and the fact that social safety net programs aren't really keeping up with that higher cost of living on the coast.
So yeah, it was interesting though when you're looking at the statistics, you always think, oh, the Central Valley, Inland California is where the poverty is. But when you start looking at the factors of housing and whatnot, all of a sudden LA County, San Diego County, the Bay Area all of a sudden start to percolate up to, hey, there's a real problem in these areas too, because the housing cost, the cost of living there.
Yeah, the cost of living is the number one factor for sure. But we also observe kind of a range of access to safety net programs, which is something to take account of. So
what do you mean by that?
Certain counties seem to enroll a higher share of eligible Californians in, for example, CalFresh, the food assistance program. We just see a range in how these programs are administered because they are county-operated programs, a lot of the ones anyway that we're talking about. And so there is a range of kind of access to that and the generosity of those benefits that come along with them.
So it's not just the program, it's how the actual program is being administered, because there's some flexibility there. So how much do safety net programs help the working poor?
I think people should understand that a lot of the safety net programs of today require work as a condition for eligibility, and that's partly why we see high rates of work among lower income or poor Californians. That said, overall, social safety net programs actually make up a relatively small amount of family budgets. So about 80% of resources, even for poor Californians, come from their earnings. That means that social safety net programs are making up about 14%. It's a little bit more if you're in a family with children, but it's around that range. So really to, I think, improve those families' outcomes and their upward mobility in economic terms, without changing our safety net programs drastically, what we need to do is address the barriers to work, the skills and things that will help them access higher paying jobs.
Why do you think the narrative is out there, though, that these people, the poor, are not working? When statistics are showing by a large percentage, 80% plus, that they are working.
I'm not sure, to be honest, as I look at these statistics every day. It seems so familiar to me, and understanding the programs, and maybe it's partly that these programs have also shifted over time to require work as a condition. One of our most important programs, the Earned Income Tax Credit, is designed so that the more you work, the more you actually get in a tax return or tax credit, which incentivizes more work and is thought of as, a kind of a gold standard, or at least a very promising approach to addressing poverty without limiting kind of the incentives for people to work.
It is interesting when you look at your statistics. You say if you have no children, 95% of your resources come from earnings. So it does say that the state and the federal government are targeting child poverty. That's kind of a focus.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, safety net programs take account of the fact that children who experience poverty in those early years tend to have worse outcomes in all kinds of things: education, their own earnings later on in life, even health outcomes. And so really focusing on children and making sure that they have the resources, food, et cetera, that they need is often a really strong driver for making good policy.
It's paying dividends as they grow up throughout their lives. Yeah. Well, up next, what are the most efficient and effective policies for the ongoing war on poverty? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. The war on poverty was a phrase coined by President Lyndon Johnson over 50 years ago, and it's still ongoing. What, if anything, can the government do to alleviate poverty? We're talking with Sarah Bohn, the Bryson Chair of Policy Research at the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. So there are lots of different public policy things that the government can do to attack poverty. One is increasing the minimum wage. Does that help get people out of poverty?
So raising the minimum wage could certainly help some workers, especially those who are able to keep their job with minimum wages increasing. However, in our research, we've identified the fact that most minimum wage workers aren't actually in poor families.
Really?
So it's not that targeted, I would say, of a policy intervention to address poverty, because the just fact is that a lot of poor workers who in poor families are already earning above minimum wage.
It's not really targeted. Minimum wage is a little bit broader scattershot than that. Okay, so let's talk about, what about access to childcare? We talked about that earlier, that sometimes takes away a lot of money that people make while they're earning, or having employers provide even a more predictable work schedule. Yeah. What impact would those kind of policies have on poverty?
So as we talked about, childcare can be prohibitively expensive for low-income families, and the programs we have today that subsidize that care would need to be expanded quite a lot in order to cover all eligible families or all low-income families who would like to use it. So that means that today families, they either spend a lot of their resources on childcare, or they might forego work, or maybe one of the parents stays home with the child, or maybe they accept a lower quality childcare than they would like. Right. And all of those things contribute to the chances of being in poverty. And then, a work schedule that's unpredictable simply exacerbates that.
Yeah, I normally, frankly, wouldn't think of work schedules, but people, they've got childcare issues that they need to know when they're working so they can make arrangements.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's bigger than you realize, huh?
Exactly. I mean, you think about children in school, you have guaranteed certain number of hours once they reach kindergarten and above. I know a lot of parents look forward to those days.
Time off. What about education and training? What about putting more emphasis on that as an impact, a way to address poverty rates?
So as we talked about earlier, I mean, I really think that education and training is one of the most promising strategies for addressing poverty and encouraging upward mobility over the long run. Given the kind of the current policy environment and our current economy that really has education and skills intertwined with success.
That doesn't necessarily mean a college education, right? It could be trade school. I mean, there's some great trades out there.
Exactly. So it's identifying those career ladders that can lead even from entry-level work to something that's in kind of the middle income range or above, and identifying the kind of educational programs or training programs that really work to get people those skills and make sure that they have the supports that they need to kind of pursue that training while they may be needing to work at the same time, and ensuring that our kind of training is flexible enough to account for that is key.
Let me ask you this. What about unionization? Back in the Depression, FDR, one of the reasons they promoted unionization was to give workers more bargaining power to increase their wages. Is that a way to take some of these people out of poverty, making it easier for them to organize?
So union membership, you hit right on it, has been a key to growing the middle class over the long term, and union membership has plummeted along with manufacturing jobs, and that has definitely affected the economic outcomes, and especially for people of color, I would note. However, I think those two things need to work together. So union membership alone might not be sufficient to kind of boost people out of poverty if you're not in an industry that has the potential for offering those middle class wages, that's growing and has opportunities.
So they have to be able to pass those costs along. The other thing, to the consumer, the other thing is it has to also be a skill level that they can afford to, an employer's going to pay that higher wage because there's a certain skill associated. Because if you organize and raise wage rates, but they can't pass those costs along, I would assume employers are going to do things like automate. I mean, you see this somewhat like in retail food, right, where you see self-checkouts. Yeah. So if the wage rates get too high, they simply go to automation. So it could result in higher unemployment.
That's right. I mean, we see so many examples of stagnant wages in different industries, and in those cases, workers having more bargaining power might help. But if the economic conditions aren't there for kind of employers to pay higher rates, I don't know if that's the comprehensive solution we're looking for.
Yeah, well, let me ask one last question, and that is about child poverty, because we've talked a lot about that. What are the social safety net programs that are the most impactful when you're talking about child poverty in particular?
Yeah, for child poverty and poverty across the board, what we see are programs that are the broadest based, like the Earned Income Tax Credit that I mentioned earlier, and the CalFresh program, which is food assistance, reduce poverty by the largest degree in our California Poverty Measure research. And I'll note that that's partly, the war on poverty and all of the programs that have been introduced since then are now kind of reflected in the measures that we use, so that we can actually measure how much these programs do work to mitigate need. And for some, it's to a large degree.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much, Sarah Bohn with the Public Policy Institute of California, for joining us. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. See you next week. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.